Welcome to Psychologist Talks. Today's going to be a brief episode on the term neurodivergence. And the reason why I'm tackling this is the term has really seemed to evolve in meaning. And as it has evolved from something more kind of targeted to something very macro, its meaning in of itself has changed and has become, I think, very misunderstood and in many ways now miswielded. So let's walk through this real quick. Neurodivergence first, from a definition standpoint, is basically just saying that somebody's brain functions different than the normal population. It was coined very early on, I think through sociology, but it was really talking about folks who are on the autism spectrum, that there is a divergence from typical neurodevelopment that is indicative of a difference in functioning and thereby symptom patterns that would qualify someone for a diagnosis. And so a very accessible, very unique, and very useful term because folks who are on the spectrum do have a lot of areas of neurodivergence. They truly do. You look at the symptom lists, go to WebMD, and you will see a lot of behavioral and a lot of social and kind of functional difficulties. And there's also anecdotal symptoms that kind of come alongside it. And they really do represent kind of a shift from what you could broadly term as a sort of neurotypical population versus the neurodiverse population. As time has rolled on, we have begun to roll more and more symptoms and diagnoses into neurodiversity. So any neurodevelopmental condition whatsoever is now considered neurodivergent, which makes good sense because there is something divergent technically from the norm. But if you look at my episode on absolutism versus relativism, there's a danger in moving from something that felt a little bit more absolute into something that is increasingly relative because it begins to lose meaning. This idea of there being a neurotypical and a neurodivergent population made more sense when the neurodivergent subset of the population was in the normal curve, well past the 75th percentile, or the 25th percentile, depending on which way you go, because it represented really truly a subset. However, as the definition expands, this notion of there being a neurotypical population becomes super interesting, because what are the limits for what diversity is versus typical is? Because human beings are vastly different from one another. We've got the same building blocks, our brains are functioning in pretty similar ways, but when we start talking about things like personality or any mental health problem whatsoever is neurodivergent, then you have a massive swath of the population that is now considered neurodivergent. Now, that's not inherently a problem. It just depends on how you wield the word and what the word is supposed to mean. Like, what are the implications for categorizing yourself or someone else as neurodivergent, quote unquote. And so I think we need to be careful depending on our goal. If the goal is simply to celebrate that people are different and that it's an inclusive label, then there's tons of neurodivergency out there. And that embracing and accepting of individual unique differences is really cool. Like, what I've always been nervous to say is like, I would identify thereby as neurodivergent in this more expanded definition. Why? Well, personality, you can look at my episodes on personality, a highly underappreciated and underrepresented diagnostic issue, a thing that comes up for huge portions of the population, represents aspects of neurodivergence. Because you talk about like fundamental biological sensitivity issues and differences, never mind if you believe that neurodivergence can be acquired, quote unquote, something that's learned, given that trauma can fundamentally affect the brain, that there's neurodivergence in that my penchant for depression and my existential kind of grief encircling the void pretty ceaselessly in my life represents neurodivergence. I also have a wildly expansive mind. I have learned by virtue of my profession and how many people I get to meet, both professionally but also through clientele, and my brain operates at a very strange level. And I don't mean like, trying to talk highly about myself. It's constantly, once it grabs hold of something, it runs with it very quickly and makes links incredibly quickly. some ways that are beneficial, but other ways that are just like hard to follow and are just too expansive. And that's where, while I would never diagnose myself with something like ADHD, I can quasi-identify with some of the problems that people with bona fide diagnoses of ADHD complain about. It's because my mind will just, and I can lose track of things because I go zooming off. But as much as that's not ADHD, it's still something that's neurodivergent, because I can tell you 9 out of 10 people, if not 99 out of 100 people I meet, just they don't describe a similar internal pattern as I do. And there's something divergent about how my brain is hardwired, I think, and how I think. Pros and cons to it. Pros and cons for sure. Not as good with the concrete, linear, step-by-step stuff. I just lose it. I absolutely get lost because I'm always shooting off somewhere. But if you're listening to this and you're part of what is traditionally called the neurodivergent population, you might be going like, who the heck is this guy, right? Labeling himself as neurodivergent. And this is the like identity politics problem, where it's like, well, what if this is inclusion when it comes to accommodations? Or what if this terminology is about appreciating people who have more difficulties, tangible difficulties interacting with the world than I might? Like these differences of mine, they're challenging in their own right. But do I see them as fundamentally interfering with my day-to-day life in a way that I would need some sort of accommodation? I don't know. I mean, I wasn't raised to think of a depressive mindset, like a chronically depressive mindset, as something I would ask for accommodations around. Yet there are younger folks in the younger generations that would argue as much. But maybe that would be too bold of me. And so, it's just an interesting evolution of the term. And there's all sorts of like cool applications out there too. Like you talk about neurodivergence, you also talk about like epigenetics, like incomplete genetic expression. It's like, why do folks on the bipolar spectrum, which we don't call it a spectrum, but why does that spectrum exist? Why is it that some people are more prone to developing psychosis secondary to medical concerns than others? Say like a dementia process, neurodiversity in that. Like, isn't that interesting? And so it's just, I don't know. Like, I sometimes question these types of episodes. It's like, what's the point? I'm just arguing semantics. But semantics matter. Words matter. How we use words and terms do matter. And I'm not sure what the answer is. If there should be an answer. Is this neurodiversity and neurodivergence term, should it be more inclusive of any individual difference? In which case everybody can claim it in their own right, technically speaking. Like if you get granular around like genetic heritage and all sorts of stuff. Or should it be more exclusive, that there are certain folks who really we should restrict using this term, except the ones that truly, when you look at the normal curve, are 2 standard deviations, apart and aside. Of course, who gets to dictate that? I don't know. So I don't know. I appreciate the appreciation of the diversity of the human condition. I mean, that's part and parcel of my work. I can't tell you how many folks I meet, vastly different, just absolutely unique ways of thinking and seeing and operating in the world, diagnosable or not. At the same time, I cringe sometimes because I worry about us kind of dishonoring, or not intentionally, but like just not honoring that there truly are folks that the neurodivergency is significant, and how they adapt and accommodate and interact with the world is vastly different than a quote unquote milder iteration of the diversity of how we develop as human beings. So that's essentially my bone to pick. I don't know what to do with that, especially as a professional who's constantly interacting with this. I mean, my clients are talking to me about this stuff all the time, and I'm sitting there going like, I got my own stuff going on too. What how are we supposed to use this? So I think what, at the end of the day, if you are watching or listening to this episode for some reason, I think at the end of the day, it's like we need to respect that there are individuals in the world that their neurodiversity is very significant. And those individuals do require society to challenge itself about how do we incorporate them into society in a meaningful way. I mean, you really have to be intentional about it. Simultaneously, anything that's in the service of celebrating the diversity of how we operate and how we function is a good thing, because I think it's easy to create monoliths out of groups of people and just be like, it's all the same. It's all just one structure. There's no differences in it. It's like, it's not quite how that works. There's great diversity in mental health. There's great diversity in personality. There's, great diversity in how people think and why they are just absolutely brilliant in one type of job and absolutely horrible in another type of job, myself included. So just think about how you're using the term and what you're trying to convey, and just be intentional with that. As long as we do that with one another, I think we're relatively solid. When we try to appropriate and take and say there's a rigid definition to this word, we either need to all agree on it, or we need to let go of that and just understand that we need to be more explicit with what we mean when we use these words as shortcuts. So, don't know if that was any use, but just kind of a thing that's kind of scratching at my brain, or I guess an itch on my brain that I'm trying to scratch, which, why am I scratching my brain? That doesn't sound very good. Anyway, all right. Well, besides that lovely imagery, I appreciate you listening and watching, and as always, stay curious.